So, Eric and LoraLee, I really want to tell you a story, and I'm really interested in getting your take on it. So, one of my clients has invested heavily in technology for commerce and experience across multiple different channels that they're engaging with, B2B, B2C. And they're really struggling with getting um, getting what they've invested in launched. They seem to struggle with, okay, if we have this new they're kind of caught in this circular motion of requirements gathering, right? So everything's done, we're ready to launch, it's in a good state. And they keep coming up with, well, if we have this feature, then we'll be good. And then, well, nope, we're still missing this. It's this whole cycle of this create, refine, and not launching. And and there has to be something within the organization or within the culture or something that really allows for this to happen. What are your thoughts?
So I think a couple of things are broken here with this customer and how they're trying to roll this out. First of all, I don't think they had a good plan for change management in place. And second, I think that it's quite possible that they didn't sit back and think of a strategy around how they're going to implement this technology and in what stages and phases they're going to implement this technology. So, what I would always say to a customer is to make sure that the plan is in place before requirements are gathered. Because what will happen is if there's no plan in place, if there's no strategy around how all of this is going to happen, and if there's no change management process to back up the strategy on technology, then you have all of these circular motions that perpetually feed each other because there's no plan, there's no strategy, there's no real uh, implementation plan, if you will. There's just perpetual requirements gathering, and everybody's emotionally invested at this point, uh, and everybody's fighting for their requirements to be the most, the best, the biggest, the first requirements that need to go. And so I think that it sounds like to me there's a lot of you know, the lack of planning has led to a lot of vying for me first, the mine's most important. So that kind of internal, perpetual, um, siloed kind of line of business approach, if you will. And I think that they step back and step away from that, talk about a strategy around the engagement, and implement some OCM around that strategy, they'll stop with this circular requirements gathering and get to a true implementation of some sort. Eric, do you want to jump in and being the OCM person, I'm sure you have a comment on what I just said.
Um, yes, I think Laura Lee, what you're describing in part, and Carrie, I think what you're describing in part too is this circular motion or this inability to commit may be due to the fact that when it's all said and done, one of the things that the organization is not seeing is a demonstration of human behaviors that show that they're actually ready to make this change. At the end of the day, what is really going to tell you whether or not a change will be successful or how it will be successful or how to evaluate that is how people behave with this new solution. So the technology itself and the requirements themselves, they can be repeated and implemented if it's done the same way in a fairly rational manner.
Hmm.
You're going to get the same response every time. The thing that's always the outlier is the behavioral piece, the emotional piece, because two people interacting with the same technology are going to could potentially have completely different feelings about how this change is going to impact them. And unfortunately, what happens is a lot of what is taken into account is exclusive of that when a change takes place. There isn't sufficient time or attention given to how are these people actually going to feel about this change, and how does that balance against their prior experience with change. So to LoraLee's point, she's describing scenarios that are typical and generally are exclusive to taking a step back and saying, culturally, how do our people feel about change? How has it been done in the past, and how has it affected them? So if you have a culture that isn't good at taking those considerations into account, you've got a built-in headwind. Before you even start talking about what the change is, simply people realizing that a change is going to take place, there's going to be a bias against that change, regardless of what the benefits are. So it's important to step back and actually take into account two considerations. One, what is your culture around change, first and foremost, and is it something that's either going to be an impetus for change, or is it going to be a barrier to change? And that's established over the course of time, right? That's embedded. And the second is, are we really looking at the employee experience with this change? Because granted, every business that exists is in business to help its customers, but using that solely as the metric for how successful a change is going to be works in contravention, right? Because a good customer experience is going to be something that's fairly quick, right? They don't have to spend a lot of time focusing on their issue. You can't use that same metric with employees who you're expecting to be bought in all day long, every day. The two metrics are diametrically opposed, and what happens a lot of times is conflation of those metrics causes an expectation that success in one arena is going to translate to success in the other arena, and that's not the case. A lot more time has to be taken to give consideration to how this impacts those employees who are actually making good on whatever promise is associated with your new solution.
That's really interesting. So, this series is about content and commerce, right? So we're talking about technologies, right? Which have a big impact on organizations. And when we talk about content and commerce, we're talking about the user experience, or the experience that people who are using the situation are engaging with, and how commerce comes together with that, right? So while you're doing marketing and you're engaging with that customer, whether they're B2B or B2C, it doesn't matter. But there's a lot of pieces that come together, and there's a lot more people involved in these scenarios where you're bringing what used to be just marketing together, which with commerce, which is now sales, right? And you're bringing them together. So it, how do organizations prepare for these changes, right? Because so many companies go into this with technology led, right? Like, we're going to pick the technology, we're going to do these things. But the reality is that all of these changes digitally are changing the way, to your point, not only the way the customer interacts, but the way the employee is interacting with those customers as well. So how do companies prepare for this? Like, what do they need to think about, but that I'm guessing nobody's thinking about right now, right?
So I think to what Eric just said, there's a there's a good lesson to be learned in that there's two kinds of experiences. There's the internal user and there's the external user. So, and like Eric said, those experiences are completely different for different reasons. And most big tech changes, whether it's e-commerce or whether it's now things are changing on the e-com side, or it's customer care driven, meaning contact center. Most of those big purchases, those big ideas, are coming from the telecom team. They're not even coming from the marketing team. Or now that's slowly changing on the e-commerce side, but still on customer care generally. The call center or the contact center lives in IT. That's where it's maintained. And those guys are not even, 100% in tune with what the external customer experience is or should be, right? So when we're looking at a massive change to a, to a company's customer care structure, whether it be internal or external, because all of those pieces matter, what they need to be aware of and how they need to affect the change in a positive way is by engaging early and quickly with change management. That's a must. And that's why Eric and I work together very closely in the customer care team when we're talking about contact center. I very rarely go in and talk to a customer without someone from Eric's team or Eric himself with me in that engagement, because we know, I think, Eric, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's like 83% of technology implementations fail due to poor change management. I think that's the stat. Uh,
You're very yes. You're very close. It's 80% of the ROI potential is realized or may not be realized due to poor change management. And yes, it's as high as 70%, LoraLee, for failed projects when that is not the consideration. Um, and in some cases with organizations that have extremely change resistant cultures, it can be even higher. Um, it I I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that, and Laura Lee's spot on when she says you have to start early. Only by starting early and talking to these individuals and talking to them about the change do you really get to where the true sources of resistance are. And it's generally not going to be the capabilities of the technology solution. You can generally assume, if it's configured correctly, if the design is appropriate, that the technology is going to behave as advertised. It's the human interaction with that technology at two different levels that affects the level, your level of success. And if the organization has a history of not doing change well, it's going to be the fact that it's any change at all that is going to cause resistance. And if individuals think that it's going to make their life harder because change has been handled ineffectively in the past, they're going to resist it simply to avoid the discomfort associated with the change. So to LoraLee's point, you don't want to find this out 24 hours before you're going to go live. You don't want to find this out in training. You want to find this early on, and usually it's going to be tangential to the conversations that you're having around your culture and how it's related to change. And there's no way, if that accumulates over the course of time, that's not going to become apparent to a customer. People that are frustrated either with their processes or their technology, or that they haven't been adequately prepared, they may not articulate it to the customer, but it's nonetheless going to affect their performance, and they're going to feel frustrated, and that to a certain degree is going to affect the customer experience, which is also another reason why it can impact ROI, because it's disruptive to your business and your business activities,
But and when we
whether
think
it's
about it,
intentional
right,
or not.
most of our businesses, regardless of who you are, was structured and set up to really support the physical sales channel, right? Whether it's retail, whether it's um, distribution or wholesale, or it's a manufacturer. So anytime you talk about digital, um,
Mm-hmm.
there's got to be a significant internal impact of now we're interacting with customers differently, right? So it's not
Yes.
simply this is a new channel like a phone or an email. Like this is completely part of your whole organization, your structure, your culture, your silos. And when you go digital, you're starting to expose those things even more. And I know, Laura Lee, like customer care is, as an example, is so significant to the success of digital because they're the people who talk to these customers. I know chat is a great example, right? We always kind of laugh about chat, but in in projects, people are always like, well, oh, we want to do chat, right? And from a technical standpoint, chat's simple, right? It's just a snippet of code you put on your site, boom. But how do you support that, right? What is the process? What's the workflow? What's the impact on the employee, who now has this new disruption coming in to their day that hasn't been planned for or addressed?
Yeah, it's really funny because a lot of companies forget while they're, marketing their brand that these are the ambassadors of their brand, right? These agents answering the phone, or answering chat or email or whatever channel you're introducing to your internal customers, being your customer care center, these are your brand ambassadors. And they're either going to deliver it well or they're not.
Right.
And if you're not taking care of them, they're not taking care of your brand. And so it's really important as a strategist around customer care to make sure that everybody's aware that this impact is going to either promote your brand or affect your brand in a negative way. Which would you prefer? Because there's only two options, right? And so when we start a customer care strategy engagement, and you both have worked with me on these before, we spend a lot of time talking to customers about, what is the end result? Where do you want to be? And then we can come up with a plan on how to get there. And like Eric said, it's not even really about the technology. Now, there's a component to the technology.
Right.
What kind of technology do you want, and how long do you want to live inside of that technology? However, the majority of the time, the drivers are around the drivers in the strategy engagements are around how do we affect the change in a positive way to promote your brand and to promote this experience both internally and externally. Because, like Eric said, most of the technologies today do the same thing. They all deliver, a chat, an email, a call. How do we do that in a way where your brand promise is delivered after every chat and every phone call and everyone is satisfied with the technology selection, because that's what they're going to point to. They're never going to point to, an effective OCM strategy or an effective, implementation strategy. They're always going to point to technology failed. The technology failed. It's not the technology. It's what Eric said.
So, LoraLee, I know that's great. I know that, you talked about a client that you had acted with, that was talking about upgrading. I think it was their document management system,
Yes.
and I know that was really an interesting, conversation, right? Do you want to talk about a little bit about that? Because I think that is such a good example of companies'
Yeah,
challenges.
yeah. When we're talking about companies that are still using, Word and Excel and creating templates inside of their own organizations and don't really understand, that there's so many, you know, knowledge-based systems that can help with these, kind of day-to-day tasks like creating a Word template or an Excel template or even an e-commerce forms, those types of things like um, you know, I think the customer you're referring to, now that I'm going to have to dig back into my memory banks on this one, but um, you know, they really struggled with, they all had silos so everybody in the organization lived in their own silo and they had their own forms and they were holding on to these forms for dear life. This was their job. It was their place. It was their form. And if that form went up into the world, well, for others to see, well, then that ends their job. Like, if you think about the structure of human behavior and our ownership in our work, right? It's our coveted work. And we've built these things and we've curated these things and we covet them. So, how do you affect a change that would take this person's livelihood and put it into the hands of technology, right? In essence, you're saying, uh, you're not, you're not valuable anymore, dear worker. Instead of saying, we have this new tool, let's migrate over there, let's have you curate these documents over there. How do you, change the psychological profile of that person who owns those things? And this is where effective change management comes into play. They really are gurus in their space, and um, they have a way to stop early saboteurs, right? Because isn't that what they are? Like, they're sabotaging kind of the growth of the company, the growth of the brand promise, the growth of the change that's needed to affect external customer care. They don't care
Right.
about that, right? They care about what they own and their own responsibility within the organization, not thinking about the downward effect of that on the external customer and the brand overall. And that's where I always work with Eric and his team on, you know, again, early in, when you spot these people, that and there's clusters of them in every business.
Right.
And then Eric's team comes in and takes over, and you know I just worry about how to get the documents to the new platform, and Eric comes in and does all the psychological work on stopping the saboteurs
So
early.
how does culture, and you mentioned culture, right? We've mentioned that a few
Yes.
times. How do Eric, how does culture really play a role in success? Because I think the reality is that we're so obsessed with the customer side, right? Like we want to be obsessed with the customer, but part of customer obsession is understanding what the customers need and want. But then it's also how do you, how does your organization also embrace that customer obsession, right? Because you can't be
Right.
effective if if your employees are not embracing that customer obsession. But how does culture play a role in that?
Well, in a couple of ways, and Laura Lee alluded to one of them. So there are a couple different types of culture. There's the culture that can exist within a particular silo, um, and then there's a broader culture within the organization, which typically is defined from the top down, and even your culture within your silos is going to reflect to a certain degree a response to the top down culture. But let's just start with the silos to begin with. The um, the saboteurs that Laura Lee mentions, and this is a classic change management question that anyone who ever interviews for a change management job is asked. How do you deal with the people that are resistant to change? Well, first off, you have to identify them. But second of all, you have to find a way to co-opt them into the process. Because in some cases, the reason they're sabotaging it could be, to Laura Lee's point, that they feel that there's some threat to their livelihood or something that, people attach a lot of emotional importance to their work. They could also feel, as I mentioned before, that within the culture, change hasn't been, it's not a culture that embraces change. It's not a culture that rewards people for taking the risks that are associated with change. So they would rather do something that's predictable and safe. The best way to get around that, quite frankly, and to break down those silos, is to have all of these different parts of the organization that are part of an ecosystem. If we think of them rather than the individual parts and how those parts fit together, that's how you have to talk about what the definition of success is, right? You have to take all of the different portions of this and say these are the different parts that have to work together. So at some point, it's helpful, rather than looking at requirements or design for a certain specific set of functionality, because people tend to specialize, it's important to understand how the entire ecosystem supports the customer experience and how many different employees along the way are part of that. And that does a couple things. One, it stresses to everybody that they are supporting each other and that individualized behavior is going to work to the detriment of someone else and that's going to impact success. And at the end of the day, most people don't want to do that. They don't want to let their peers down. Secondly, they can also see the scalability of the solution and thinking in terms of bigger picture, and they will see that this isn't about an isolated activity of one form going away. It's about building improvements into the process. And that's where you get into something called the what's in it for me. You can argue bigger benefits and smaller benefits, but at the end of the day, most organizations, when they're doing this, they're actually doing this because they want to leverage the intellectual capital that they have more effectively. To LoraLee's point, your people that are your brand ambassadors, you want them on the phone talking to customers, able to get that answer quickly, able to get them directed to the right resource to solve their problem. You don't want to get the sense that they're hunting around or they're uncomfortable, right? They're part of a larger ecosystem that should all support that end goal. And you're going to see that in the behavior. You're going to see that in their confidence. You're going to see that in their interactions with the customer, how quickly they can get to a definitive answer, etc. But it's necessary to unpack all of that, all of those representative parts, and kind of lay them out and say, here's how the entire ecosystem supports one another. And then that way they don't feel isolated. It's generally a sense of isolation where the threat or the fear comes from. And that's where a lot of your resistance comes from.
So that's really interesting. So when we think about commerce, right? I mean, one of the things I like to point out to people is commerce. If you sell, if you're in the business to sell products or services, the core of your business is commerce, right? Whether you sell it, you do it digitally or through traditional sales channels, you're in the business of commerce, right? And if you think about all of the people that are involved, not even directly with the customer, but behind the scenes as well, that are interacting and that are impacted by this whole concept of digital, right? There's a lot happening. And we spend so much time talking about the customer and who are they and what are their personas and what are their journeys, right? But I think you brought up a really good point is what's the employee journey, right? What is happening
Mm-hmm.
behind the scenes that supports all of those things that are happening in front, right? Finance, as an example, has a role, right? They're doing something. How you go to market today also may change when you think about commerce, right? Digital commerce. We may go through physical channels today, or we're going to go digital with our B2B partners, distributors, dealers, wholesalers, whatever, retailers. But we also may say like we want to go direct to our customers or direct to a consumer, and now that all starts to have a huge impact on your employees as well. LoraLee, you're smiling. What did I say that really
I'm
resonated?
Well, because really back to, when I'm looking at customer care strategy holistically, all of it, including agents, one thing gets left off the table all the time, and that's training for the internal agents, right? Again, if we talk about what are these people doing they are your brand ambassadors. So if they're going direct to consumer and they were B2B or
Right,
some other form of sales in your organization before, or they had some different touch point within your organization before, and all of a sudden they're going to direct to consumers, that's a whole different ballgame than dealing with a business. It's a
right.
different mindset, it's a different response level, it's a different engagement. Again, major change. So what I always say is, what does your training look like for that, dear customer? I love the idea. I think it's amazing. But here's OCM doing some psychological evaluation and playing with your internal people. Now let's look at training, because we can talk to them all day long about, this change is coming, but if they're not trained and prepared and psychologically ready for it, I do have a customer who did in fact make such a change just after the pandemic, and they decided that they wanted to, kind of reshift how they do business. And they were kind of a sales and service organization before. So either you were being serviced on the product you bought as an agent, that you were servicing the customer who bought the product, or you were selling the product. So there were two lines of, agent, and never the two should meet, right? That's how it was, and that's how it was, and they were trained that way. Then all of a sudden, they're meshed. So, they had 4-hour wait times. They were trying to reduce wait times. And how were they doing that? They were going to, in effect, make all agents equal. And what happened was a mass exodus, first of all. There was very little training for these agents. And what happened to their brand? Well, it was in a really bad place for a very long time until they said, okay, wait, these agents are not prepped, they're not trained, they're not mentally ready for this after 2 years of torture. And I'll just also say that this was in the travel industry, which was drastically hit by the last 2 years. So they'd already been tortured enough by, people calling in wanting refunds, and, just the pure exhaustion of, are we traveling? Are we not traveling? What are the rules? What are not the rules? And hey, by the way, sales is now service and service is now sales. No training. So they had to walk that back, and it really damaged them in their ability to become more forward thinking and to try and get out of the, kind of pre-pandemic box that travel was in, right? You call up, you book your trip, you pay the money, and away you go, right? They send you your documents. Well, now all of a sudden things have changed. A lot has changed in the travel industry. So they really did not effectively implement change management, and they did not effectively implement training, and also a support system for the internal customers, because there's going to be a lot when you're melting all of your agents into one pot. um, there was no kind of peer mentoring, and that's also really important. And when I talk to customers about strategy, if we're going to make a big change like this, we have to really talk about who's going to mentor these guys into a new mindset on a long-term basis, right? um, when Proficient leaves, after we've helped you affect all these changes, after OCM has worked their magic, and after we've successfully migrated you to this new technology, and your teams are now, taking over, and we're walking it back, what's going to happen when we leave? Peer mentorship is super important to a solid brand promise when we're talking about call centers. So when you said that, I had to smile because, a lot of companies don't think about ongoing training, updating your internal client, your internal customers, and making sure that everybody is still on board with the brand promise.
Well, so we've talked a lot about, technology. I mean, digital's here to stay, right? It's not going
Yeah.
away. And it's going to
Uh-uh.
continue to grow and expand, right? We are just starting um, in a lot of instances with this whole journey, right? And um,
Yep.
I mean, there's going to be change with the way we manage data, the way we interact with customers, how we track and interact with our customers, how we track and interact with our partners, right? All of these things, how we sell, all of these things are being impacted, right? So everybody really in the organization is impacted by digital in some way, shape, or form. So Eric, when we think about that, what should companies really be thinking about as part of these concepts and strategies, right? We're seeing companies focus, like I said, on understanding the buying journey. Now let's talk about that customer journey, the employee journey. How do organizations really start prepping for this? Because that external change, and our customers are driving that change, right? If we don't change and
Mm-hmm.
adapt, we're not going to be around because customers are becoming digitally obsessed with, and that's how they want to interact with companies more and more and more, and that's going to continue to grow and change. So how do organizations need to think internally and start planning for internally for these continuous change, because I think change is the name of the game, and it's going to be the name of the game for everybody going forward.
Yeah.
I think that it's probably best for most companies to realize that human behavior evolves a lot more slowly than the technology does. At least in terms of the employees that are supporting the promise that you're making to your customers with digital technology. Not only is digital here to stay, but digital is something that increasingly every day raises the bar for how quickly we're going to be able to respond to a customer need. That's almost the opposite of what you have to do in terms of the investment of time to get your employees ready. You talked about people that come from a tradition still of physical channels.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a people facing business. For that to be seen as valuable, people invested time. Now we're talking about flipping that around and saying it's more valuable to me as a customer if I can get through that experience quickly. That requires people changing behaviors and habits that have been embedded for years and years, especially if they've been successful at what they do and they've seen it work for them. And I'm going to go back to LoraLee's training example because I think that's very, very telling. To train people correctly requires an investment of time. It requires time to think about what their experience is going to be like. It requires time away from their job. It requires time for them to digest this information and apply it. And generally, you can see in the attitude towards training that an organization has, their overall sense of how much time should be invested in preparing their employees. Because the very worst thing you can do is have someone show up to training, and I had this happen to a peer of mine, and a hand goes up and they say, "Why are we here again? Why is this changing?" If the training class becomes a referendum on the change,
Yeah.
you have lost about 2/3 of the runway that you should have used to get those people prepared. Because by the time they come into training, what they should be doing is validating everything that you've told them about the benefits of this solution, which is this is going to work for me and it's going to work well and it's going to make things better. If they get into training and they don't know why they're there, then you're going to lose valuable time to support that in their minds. And also, as LoraLee mentioned, you have to have a solid support network because no matter how good the training is, people will not actually absorb this and apply this until they are doing it in context as part of their daily work. And so you need a support network. Typically we call them change agents, but of embedded peers that do the same work that they do, that have been through the training, that can say, yeah, remember in the training, this is where we covered it this way. And here's where you go to a job aid or a video to reinforce it. Those should never be the exclusive way to train people. They should be complementary because at the end of the day, the real behavior change and the internalization takes 3 to 6 months after the training takes place to really get absorbed and for people to turn that into the new way of working.
So when organizations are investing in technology, right, and they're worrying about their customer and they're aligning to their customer, what should they be doing internally, right, before we get to training, before we get to all of these things? What should they be thinking about um, the overall internal impact, right, of these things that we're doing? Because we're seeing companies, a lot of companies have done commerce as an example, digital commerce for a long time. They haven't been successful, right? So now they're saying we've made all these investments. Some companies have made millions of dollars of investment and it's not working, right? Part of it is because they don't
Mm-hmm.
have an onboarding plan and they don't have employees that are engaged, and they never asked the customer what they wanted or what they needed, right? So all of these pieces. So now we're coming back and we're saying, where we'd love them to start with strategy, we're seeing people go, okay, we invested in the right technology, we built all these features and functionalities, and now we don't have adoption internally or externally. So
Mm-hmm.
what should organizations do so that they don't put themselves into that position in the future?
LoraLee, you want me to take that?
Please.
Um, they have to ask themselves a very honest question when they talk about, let's say, requirements. Um, who they actually design those requirements for. They have to ask themselves, did they create an implementation plan? Did they create requirements? Did they make decisions as the people that were implementing the technology and designing the solution? Did they make those decisions for their benefit, or did they make them for the benefit of the end users? Because generally speaking, adoption is going to be based on a sense of personal investment in the solution. And this is why I go back to the training example. If people don't have regular opportunities to contribute to the solution, they don't feel that they own it, and they don't feel that the solution has really been created for them. So a lot of organizations, they have very aggressive timelines and very robust portfolios of solutions that they need to implement, right? That's different, and that can work in contravention to saying we need to go to the end users and find out what they really need. And when those two are not done in concert, and there has to be compromise and a bit of consensus on both sides, you end up with it feeling like this solution is actually being imposed on others. This is a change that is happening to them. And I think one of the things that you learn when we talk about culture is that everybody in this organization wants to serve the customer. No one has a better day at work than when they've done something to help a customer and they said, boy, thank you so much for the extra time, right? But if that's done in isolation and you don't bring people together, you're generally going to get the same themes emerging over and over again. You don't get a holistic solution. You get it that's built to fix certain problems versus taking the long view that says, how is this going to help the customer journey? And since the customer's journey is guided by one or more employees that they're going to encounter during their digital commerce experience, it should make sense that those employees know where the handoffs are, that they know when they're going to take this person to the next milepost, and then another person is going to take them on that journey. In the absence of taking that holistic view, that's not going to happen. And so it's necessary to say, who are we really building this solution for? Who really defines what success looks like? And generally, adoption doesn't happen when the people who are the primary users aren't engaged early and often and have a voice in that process.
Yeah, I'll just say to what Eric said, you know, when we run strategy engagements along with Eric's group, with the OCM group, we start early talking to different groups cross lines of business, and we do workshop groups where we're bringing everybody in, we're asking everybody their opinions. We get negative ones, doesn't matter, that's really not what it's there for. It's really there to start the conversation about change and to open up people's dialogue, to start asking questions and give them line of sight to what we're doing. And that really just opens the conversation early. Like Eric said, Eric and I have both said this a couple of times, early and often. And that starts in a work group. And, we start at the very basics, contact center, right in right in the start of the organization, right in the heartbeat of the organization, talking to agents, sitting with them, asking them, what will make your life better? What serves the customer better? And then we work our way up to the C levels from there. Because really, if you start at the top, you're not getting what everybody else needs. You're only getting what they hear or think that the agents need. We need to start at the bottom, start the conversation, and that conversation bleeds all the way up through. And that's how to affect proper change for technology, right? You start it with the agents in the contact center. That's my belief anyway.
I think that makes a lot.
No, I agree. Yeah, I agree, because I think in part what LoraLee's talking about is whenever you look at change, and we have documentation that has come out of engagements that shows this. When you look at change, you look at the individual scenarios the activities that you're trying to execute, the solutions you're trying to solve, the processes that you're trying to make more efficient, and you look at who is impacted most heavily, and conversely, if the solution meets their needs, who has the ability to have the greatest impact. And to LoraLee's point, the people that are in the contact center are the folks that are the first line of contact with the customers. And so having a positive impact on their experience and providing service to the customers also means that when they're effective in that, they have the highest level of impact on the business, because the customer is going to take that experience away and say, I just had a fantastic experience with this person in the contact center. They really helped me. I mean, they answered my question quickly. They knew exactly what to do. That doesn't come without a lot of refining work, of looking end to end at the process, knowing what the handoffs are, right? And then reinforcing it in training and support. You know, it's kind of like in the American game of football, when you see a play that has 2 or 3 different options, depending on the circumstances, and that play runs really, really smoothly. Anyone who knows this knows that that play has been mapped out and then discussed and then walked through and then run through at half speed over and over and over again. And we should take the same level of appreciation for the time that's invested to run a single good play on a football field, and say that level of investment is required to also make people confident and competent when they're at work and we're changing something. And something is changing every day. So it's important to realize that that investment of time in the front end pays dividends in terms of the customer experience on the back end, and certainly in the digital era, because increasingly customers have an expectation that it's going to be quick and it's going to be spot on, and that requires work in the background on the human side to move with that degree of speed.